In today's world, people feel lost in a sea of ideas. Which ones should we accept? Stay tuned because you're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Here is your host, Kurt Jarris.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining us here for another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Very nice to be with you here on our countdown to episode 200. This is episode 197. Very excited. We have some great guests and some great topics coming up as we head towards our final weeks here at Veracity Hill. I say final, I mean it's an indefinite hiatus that we're headed toward, I should say. The future of Veracity Hill will remain uncertain in terms of new interviews, but the ministry will continue on with various clips being cut here and there and engagement with our followers. So we hope the ministry will continue on, even if we're taking a break with, well, we're not sure when it may end. But we'd love to get your support to keep the ministry itself going. Go to our website, veracityhill.com. And of course, if you have loved the interviews that we've done throughout the years, please consider giving us a review on iTunes, the Google Play Store, or our Facebook page. That way, when people are new to discovering our program, they see what you think about it. So we'd love to get your support in that way. On today's episode, I am very excited about this subject matter because sometimes the facts are the facts, and Christians, theologians, apologists, and even lay level can sometimes be misinformed about the strength of arguments for the reliability of the text of Scripture. And not that we should lose confidence entirely in its reliability, but we shouldn't overstate the case. And sometimes there are points in Scripture, there are points in the process of Scripture's transmission, or other various issues that fall in the realm of what's called textual criticism that can be sort of a thorn in the flesh for certain styles of arguments for the Christian faith. And apologists ought to make moderate and yet accurate claims about Christian history and the text that we say is divinely inspired. So to this end, our guest on today's show is Peter Gurry. He's received his bachelor's from Moody Bible Institute and his THM from Dallas Theological Seminary. He's also received his PhD from Cambridge. And in 2017, he joined the faculty at Phoenix Seminary, where he teaches courses in New Testament literature and Greek language. Research-wise, his interests include the history of New Testament scholarship, the Bible's history and formation, and Greek grammar. He and his wife are members of the Whitten Avenue Bible Church. And let me say this as well. Peter enjoys, much like to myself, we are kindred spirits, he enjoys cheap, fast food. Peter, it is such a pleasure to have you on our program today.
It's great to be here. Thanks.
Now, you are the co-editor of this book, Myths and Mistakes in New Testament Textual Criticism. And we are going to be putting a link to this book at our website so people can check it out. It is a hefty collection of essays, and it is in many ways and in some regards data heavy, not like scientists would be on their teleological argument books. I've got a few of those, so not as much data there, but still, you guys, the group of scholars you've brought together for this book, for this work, are folks all interested in textual criticism who want to pursue the truth. And as I mentioned earlier, sometimes Christians have a way of overstating the case, and that's something that Christians should be cautious of. Is that the motivation behind the book, that you wanted to help Christians realize, hey, wait a second, we can't say that, or we ought not say that? So what were the motivations for putting together something which kind of reins in certain apologetic arguments or theological doctrines which are defended in Christian circles?
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. It's Elijah and I we were finishing up our PhDs at the time, and we were both doing dissertations on text criticism, so we were pretty pretty up to speed with the discipline, and both of us are evangelicals, and so we kind of were familiar with evangelical apologetics on this issue, and we just started to realize, the argument for the textual reliability of the New Testament is pretty strong. I mean, it's comparatively speaking to other literature, it's pretty amazing. But man, we kept seeing this exaggerated apologetic material out there, and we realized it's going to end up hurting us in the long run if these arguments keep getting perpetuated. So it was kind of just an attempt to say, hey, we don't actually need the sensationalism on this issue. Like, we have real good evidence for this, and I don't think text criticism really needs to be a reason for significant doubts for people in their faith. So let's just kind of cut through the sensationalism and show what the evidence really is.
All right, why don't we first ask a very basic question, and I'm sure I've asked this question before on past episodes, but for our audience, let's take a quick refresher. What is the field of textual criticism? Right.
So it's a bit of an unfortunate name because people hear it and they often think, well, it's criticizing the Bible. That is, it's saying bad things about the Bible, but it's not. Text criticism is something that's has to be done for any ancient literature, and honestly, it's done even on modern literature as well. And it's essentially any time the original document of some piece of literature is lost and the surviving copies disagree with each other textually, you need to do this process we call textual criticism, which is comparing the copies that we do have and trying to determine as best we can what the original of that work said. So it's pretty simple. You have to do it for the Bible. You have to do it for Herodotus, the ancient historian. You have to do it for Shakespeare. There's even text criticism on modern authors.
Yes, I could think. There might be Lord of the Rings nerds that want to see what the first draft was of the Fellowship of the Ring, and they'll compare the modern day text that they have printed on their bookshelf and find a handwritten copy and want to compare. And maybe when we put it like that, we want to pursue the truth, but yet there's hope that what we have is perfect, right? Now, there are some sensational authors on the other side. Perhaps most well-known is Bart Ehrman, who has said, and sometimes, to his credit, sometimes he's taken out of context, but he's known for saying, what we have are copies of copies of copies. We don't while it's true we don't actually have the original, but he may say something like this. He or someone of that camp would say, we can't know what's there. And now maybe he sneaks in his view of, epistemology. What does he mean there? And so that's where people need to be cautious. So what are we talking about here when we're looking at like 99.9% reliability? That's too high maybe. And I know that's just one field too, and we're going to get into some meaty and maybe some difficult examples for some people to consider.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple ways you can think about it. One is when it comes to the epistemological question, I think that's a really important one, and sometimes is neglected in this discussion. So for somebody like Bart, if he's convinced that we can't know the original, I just want to ask him, well, what does he mean by no, and how does he know we can't have it? Right? It's actually pretty hard to prove a negative, so I don't take that claim all that seriously. Just because if Bart doesn't think I can prove to him that I have the original text, well, so what? And if he thinks that he can prove to me that I don't have it, well, that's a pretty hard thing to prove. Instead, usually probably what he means is something more like, because we have so many variants, we have to decide between them, and that involves human judgment. And so there's always going to be some room for question of our own judgments. Okay. And so then we get into the question of, okay, well, how many variants are there, and how much does human judgment play in our decisions between them? And really, how many of them are we uncertain about, like really uncertain about? And that's where I think it can be helpful to look at the data and the statistics. And if you keep them in perspective, the statistics can be helpful. So I like to do a little, statistic analysis and say, how many estimated variants do we have in our manuscripts? And I suggest we have about 500,000. So that is a lot. That's actually more than Bart has said in his writing. He said between 200 and 400,000. The problem is that he doesn't really give us any reason for that number. It's just his own kind of educated guess. So I actually did some work during my PhD program and tried to say, here's a reliable estimate based on scholarly editions that we have, where they've actually compared a lot of manuscripts in a particular portion of the New Testament. I went through and did the very tedious, boring job of actually counting, and then it was a boring project. But everybody wants to know, how many variants do we think we have? So I thought, well, let's count where we actually know, and then we'll extrapolate from there. So that's what I did. But once you get down to it, I like to look at something like John chapter 18, where we have something like I counted something like 3,000 variants, okay, in an edition of just John 18. Okay, so one chapter of John's gospel, 3,000 variants. We have about 800 words in John 18 in Greek, okay? So Bart is right when he says things like we have way more variants than we have words in the New Testament. But that, in my mind, is a basically meaningless comparison, because he's comparing a fixed entity, the number of words in some printed edition, to a non-fixed number, which is the number of variants in our manuscript. And well, every time you find a new manuscript of John 18, you're going to probably add another few variants. Do you see? So that's a moving number, whereas his other number is fixed. So I like to say, let's compare more apples to apples and think in terms of how many words did scribes copy of John 18 in all our copies of John 18, right? So for that, you have to multiply 800 words by the number of manuscripts we have of John 18, and it comes out to, I think, something like 1.3 million words that they copied. Do you see? So in other words, there was a lot of copying of John 18. There are a lot of words, let's say, in their manuscripts, okay? So in that perspective, then, every time they copied one word, they had an opportunity to make an accidental mistake, right? And so sure enough, they did. They made a lot of them total, okay? And then the question we have to ask is, how many of those 3,000 variants in John 18 matter? How many are we on the fence about, or we're not sure? And that's where I think it can be helpful to just look at the scholarly work that's been done on it and show how in, let's say, an edition of the Greek New Testament designed for Bible translators, there's, I think, maybe less than a dozen variants or something in John 18 recorded. And if you check the footnotes of your English Bible, like the ESV or the NASB, you'll find no footnotes at all in John 18 about, some manuscripts say, okay? Now, I don't want that to give the impression that no variants matter at all, or that no variants are difficult to decide. Some are, and I discuss 3 of them in my chapter in the book, just to give people a sense of kind of what some of the difficult ones are. But by and large, people should not be thinking that every page in the New Testament is completely in doubt because of text criticism, right? That would be a vast misunderstanding of the situation. So does that help? Is that
for sure. And let's jump a little bit into your chapter, and also consider at the same time a bigger question too about the importance of some variants are so small and don't matter whatsoever, even for the interpretation of the text, or even the English translation, right? So we can still get it really close. Even if there's a different word, it could mean the same thing. Like, I threw the ball to Chris, or the ball was thrown to Chris, something like that. Right. At any rate, okay, so there's minuscule of importance, but then there are some other examples where they are a bit more theologically, can affect our theological beliefs. Yes, right. Yeah.
So probably the two most famous passages, and they're famous partly because they're so unique, okay, in terms of their length, is the ending of Mark's Gospel and the woman caught in adultery. These are the two most famous because they're so long. They're the only two examples we have of this kind of length where we have a real serious textual problem. And in particular, these are so famous partly because they've been in the English Bible for so long. Okay, another one that's pretty famous, although not nearly as well known today, is 1 John 5:7, which was debated for a long, long time. Even people like Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton wrote a whole monograph on this variant and one other one in Timothy. And so, people always think Isaac Newton's famous for discovering gravity. I think he's famous as a text critic, but there we are. As I like to say, all the best scientists are really good text critics. But so, for a long time, that variant was a big, big deal to people. And most people today unless they've grown up on the King James Version, have never even heard of that verse, because it's rightly not in our English Bibles anymore. Does
That's
that make
one of
sense?
those fun examples where it'll skip from verse 5 to verse 7.
Yeah, yeah. I think that one actually there is a verse number, but you're right. There are other ones like that, like in Acts chapter 8, verse 37, I think. No, exactly. So I'll jump to the one though that I think is most significant, or at least significant to me, and that is Jesus' prayer from the cross, which is in Luke's gospel, Luke 23:34. Then there Jesus prays, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," which is a remarkable prayer, right? And especially remarkable given where he prays it. He's actually on the cross. And to think that on the cross, while he's experiencing that excruciating pain, he would be thinking about the people who are doing it to them and offering them forgiveness, right? Praying for their forgiveness. The problem with that verse is that it's not found in some of our early and very important manuscripts. And the question is, why would anybody want to remove that? Okay, so the fundamental question that we always ask in text criticism is, where we're faced with, let's say, two variants, okay, we want to ask the question, which one best explains how the other one came into existence, okay? And whichever one can best explain the other ones is probably original, okay? So with that one, we wrestle with the question of, if that's not original, that prayer is not original to Luke's gospel, where did it come from? Okay, so that's one of the questions you have to ask. And some people suggest, well, it's borrowed from Stephen's prayer in Acts. Stephen prays a similar prayer when he's being stoned, right? And maybe some scribes thought, well, Stephen has this amazing prayer, Jesus has to one-up him. Okay. But it still doesn't explain the exact form of the prayer in Luke. It's not the exact same as Stephen's prayer, so I'm not entirely convinced that explains it. There is also a reference to a very similar prayer on the lips of James, the brother of Jesus, from an early church father who records a prayer like that for James. And so those are possible sources for it. But even then, it still doesn't perfectly explain why it would be inserted there in Luke's gospel. You know, you still have other things to explain. Does that make sense? Like,
right. So what you're saying is, in the earliest manuscripts, and there's a debate, and we'll get into some of that as well. Like, should we go for the earlier?
Yes.
In the earliest manuscripts, that prayer isn't even there. So it's not that Jesus said something different. It's just absent altogether. And so that leads one who believes we should go with the earliest to say, well, hang on a second, where did that come from then? And so we look for other sources to see similar language. And obviously preferable would be identical language, because then you could explain the slip of the copyist, or even if there's an editorial remark by a scribe. Sometimes we have evidence of that. So that would be a mistake that slips in to the text if we're seeking to get to the earliest form of what the text was. Yep. So I follow.
So, and then on the other side, there is evidence from the early church that the early church was actually troubled by this verse for various reasons. So one of the questions we ask in text criticism is there any reason why scribes would have been uncomfortable with the verse and wanted to make it easier for themselves? Okay. And this doesn't always have to be nefarious. It can be, but it doesn't always have to be. Sometimes it's just they're reading their Bibles and saying, let's say they're in the Synoptic Gospels, and they say, well, this isn't the way Jesus said that, because they're familiar with the text from one of the other Gospels. So they think, well, my manuscript is messed up, right? They were aware of textual variants like we are, maybe not to the same degree, but they were quite aware that scribes before them made mistakes, and so they didn't always have as big a problem correcting the manuscript in front of them, right? So one of the arguments for the prayer from the cross is the fact that some early Christian writers did have a theological problem with this prayer for a couple reasons. One is some were bothered because it seems to present Jesus extending forgiveness to the Jews, and they felt that God had judged the Jews in the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, and so you had a problem with either they didn't want Jesus to offer forgiveness to the Jews, or they simply felt that this was a prayer that God didn't answer in light of the destruction of Jerusalem, do you see? So they thought, well, man, we have to explain this verse somehow, right? So there's a number of reasons why early Christians had some trouble with this verse whereas we tend to just read it and be, think it's amazing. It's great. They actually were somewhat troubled by it theologically. So some have suggested that some early scribe may have been troubled enough by it that he cut it out, that he removed it, right?
So in this case, it was there in the original, and a scribe removed the text that was in the original.
Correct.
So in this particular situation, then, we would say that these variant readings are not the earliest. And
right.
So if we're trying to get to the earliest, then we should only be bothered not by the original text, like those scribes were, but by what the scribes have done to the text.
Right. Sure. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yep. So at the end of the day, I think this is a good example to use because it illustrates a couple things that I think are important. One is, it is, in my opinion, a pretty difficult variant. Okay, that is, the evidence on either side is good, and there's good arguments that can be made for either the prayer being original to Luke's gospel or it not being original to Luke's gospel. Okay, so it illustrates that there really are sometimes tough decisions that text critics have to make, that Bible translators have to make, that commentators have to make, and that eventually pastors have to make too, right, in preaching the text. Mm-hmm. So it's a difficult variant. It's also one that matters, right? I don't think any Christian, no Christian would read this verse and say, I don't care if it's in my Bible or not, right? I mean, I care a lot. It's an amazing prayer, and I want to know if Luke records this as coming from Jesus on the cross or not. Like, it's really incredible, and so I'd like to know. But at the same time, even though it's a difficult variant, even though it's a difficult variant that matters to me, it's still not a difficult variant that fundamentally changes the theology of the New Testament, in my opinion. Okay? So some people might look at a variant like this and say, well, see, this changes our view of Jesus in Luke's gospel. And I'd say, well, it changes our view of Jesus in Luke's gospel at this point, yes, if he prays it or if he doesn't, I suppose. But it's not like if we don't have this verse in our Bible, then Jesus never tells us to love our enemies or to forgive people.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that would be absurd to try to claim that if we don't have this verse, then Jesus doesn't teach us to forgive people. Of course he does, right? And we even see, say, in somebody like Stephen, a clear example of someone forgiving their enemies, right, in the New Testament. Then you could show this even in early Christian writings after the New Testament, you see the same theme of instruction and the practice of forgiving enemies, right? So I think what we lose if the verse is not there is we lose an incredible example from Jesus of what he taught us to do, but we don't actually lose his teaching on forgiveness. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. So to use a technical term even, if we didn't have this passage, we should still forgive our enemies. And
yes.
we could think that what Jesus did on the cross, where forgiving people who may not even be sorry, that's what some might call a supererogatory action, or what I call in common parlance going above and beyond the call of duty.
Indeed. So, yeah, that's right.
Right.
That's right.
And so if, it doesn't matter for our a reliable picture of Jesus by any means.
Right.
We'd still have the deity of Christ and the teachings on how we should live. So
that's right. We still this variant doesn't affect the Sermon on the Mount, right? Or even Luke's Sermon on the Plain, let's say. So again, I would never want to say it doesn't matter at all. It does matter, which is why I care, which I continue to wrestle with it in my head and look at the evidence. But it's not like my faith is hanging in the balance. Right.
Yep.
It's not.
Now, in this particular case, we are considering that oldest is better, right?
Yes.
We want to try to get to the oldest.
Yes.
But maybe let's take a step back and open a can of worms with a few minutes to go before break and say, why should we think that? Why should we strive for the oldest instead of maybe some where there are more manuscripts or there is a chain of custody where a church has been responsible and thought this family of manuscripts should be preferred over seeking some combination of the oldest?
Right. Yeah, it's a good question. So you can answer that question from two angles. One, from the text critical side, and then one from the theological side. Okay, so I'll start with maybe the theological. Whether you think God's authoritative word is found in the words of the apostles and their associates who wrote the books of the New Testament, or whether you think the authority of God's word rests in the church, that's a pretty important question, right? So one will lead you to something like Roman Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy, and one will lead you to Protestantism. I'm a happy Protestant, as I like to say. So I think that authority ultimately resides in the apostles and their associates who wrote the New Testament. Okay, so I want to know what Luke said, what he wrote, rather than what some scribe later wrote, and even more so than what some church accepted him as having written. Does that make sense? Okay, so if the Eastern Orthodox Church says, hey, we don't care what, I mean, they don't say this, but if they said what matters to us is the text that's been received by the church, that's what's really important, I would say, okay, I'm not Eastern Orthodox, I'm Protestant, and I want to, I put authority where in the apostolic words, let's say that, okay? I think those are the ones that are inspired.
And with that argument, you're really trying to work at clear the ground and say, what is the truth? Where is that right. treasure of what right. really actually happened?
Right.
Not so as we had it in the 300s or 400s.
Correct. Right. Now, exactly. So, I want God's inspired word, his God-breathed words. And I think those are through the apostles, not through later scribes, and not ultimately through the church either, right? It's through the apostles. And then on the text critical side, in terms of kind of early versus later, then the question is, most text critics still want to try to find the words of the authors, whether it's because they believe in inspiration or not. So you can not be a Christian, you can not believe in inspiration, and you still want to know what Paul said, for example, right? As opposed to what some later scribes said Paul said. So I think even just from purely historical perspective, you can still want the author's words as opposed to later scribes' words. Then the question is, where do we find those? Where are we most likely to find those? And that's where you get in the question, is it in the earliest manuscripts or is it in the most manuscripts? Okay, and that's kind of usually the debate. And I'm decidedly on the side of those who think that the number of manuscripts alone is not what's important. It's the quality of the manuscript. So if, for example, I have a bad manuscript and I copy it 1 billion times and I copy it perfectly, what I have is 1 billion copies of a bad manuscript, right? Okay. So what I would rather have is one good manuscript. If I have the choice between that and 1 billion bad ones, I'll take the one good one, right? Okay. Now, it's obviously not a choice between good or bad. It's usually a choice between good and better, okay, in terms of our New Testament manuscripts. But I still want the better ones. And I'm convinced just from working with the manuscripts that generally speaking, not always, okay, definitely not always, but generally speaking, our earlier manuscripts tend to be better overall. Okay, they're not always right, and I would stress that they are not always right. So I'm for any Byzantine folks listening to this who know what I'm talking about, I'm happy to accept Byzantine readings as original. All right, I just don't think the Byzantine text is always right, and I don't think it's more right than something like Codex Vaticanus is.
We're going to. We're going to head to a break. I want to follow up on this. You use some terms, labels, Byzantine and Vaticanus.
Yeah.
So we'll draw that out a little bit and then talk about maybe the history of the KJV onlyist or the rationale, not necessarily history, but the rationale there, since that can be common for people who think that the authorized version is the only version we should be reading. So we'll touch base on that and some other issues in textual criticism. On today's episode, I'm joined by Peter Gurry, co-editor of Myths and Mistakes in New Testament Textual Criticism, a great resource for people, collection of essays, which I find makes it easier to read sometimes. You've got maybe, an hour, read a chapter. You don't have to commit to the whole book, but take it chapter by chapter when you've got time. Again, we'll be sure to put a link to the book on our website. And when we come back, we'll continue our discussion on textual criticism, myths and mistakes. Stick with us through the short break from our sponsors.
You're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
Evangelical Christians are talking about hell. What if we believe what we believe because we've always believed it? What if the gospel is really a matter of life and death? We want you to open your mind, open your Bible, and rethink hell. At rethinkinghell.com, evangelicals look at what the Bible says about hell, putting conventional and controversial views to the test.
Let's say there's this Christian apologist. You love their message, but have trouble finding their videos, their articles, or social media posts. How do you stay connected to them? We're on it. Defenders Media uses the tools of the digital age to create content for your favorite apologists. We give them more screen time, more digital soapboxes, and more presence to deliver more of the content that you love. That's what we do.
I know that social media is important to those of you who follow my work. Many respond to my videos and posts on Facebook and Twitter, but it becomes impossible after a while to keep up with it all and to continue with research. That's why I'm thrilled that we have found a solution, Defenders Media.
Whether it's a website, whether it's printed material, whether it's a question on graphics, I cannot do what I do and reach my audience without the help of Defenders Media. They have been integral in helping me to reach my audience.
Defenders Media ensures consistent content reaches your hand from today's leading apologists and apologetic ministries, like Mike Lycona, Apologetics 315, the Veracity Hill podcast with Kurt Jarris, and more.
To learn more, text the word Defenders to 555-888, and we'll send you a free PDF of the top 5 ways to share the gospel online. Thanks for sticking with us through that short break from our sponsors. If you'd like to learn how you can become a sponsor, you can go to our website, veracityhill.com. There are 3 different sponsorship levels, and we'd love to get your support for our program to continue the ministry of Veracity Hill for a long time to come. On today's episode, we're talking about textual criticism, the myths and mistakes. But before we jump back to our conversation, we've got a segment on the program that we like to call...
What's Behind Kurt?
What's Behind Kurt is the name of the program. I've got a green screen behind me, and presumably Chris has been putting up the banner of Veracity Hill during the interview thus far. But now is a time where I'm going to set 3 minutes on my phone here, and I have 15 questions to guess what on earth, or maybe not on earth, is behind me. And so it's really a fun... short segment. When we first got started, we were kind of learning by trial and error how long and how many questions. We had started off, I think, with 12, and that was virtually impossible. Yeah. 15, my batting average is, I don't know, maybe like 250. 1 out of 4, maybe. You know? Mm-hmm. I mostly lose these segments, but every now and again I win, and that's fun. Okay, so Chris, you've got something up behind me?
I do.
Okay, I'm going to start the stopwatch, and I'll get going.
Okay, here we go.
Is it a person?
Yes.
Is it a fictional person?
No.
Is this person alive today?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, you're not sure about that.
I'm fairly certain.
Okay.
Yes.
Are they a celebrity?
Yes.
Is it a politician?
No.
Sometimes people think that's the case. So you're a little, your yes on the celebrity question was, are they in the entertainment industry?
Yes. Qualify entertainment.
They're on TV or in the movies, or maybe an author of a book.
Based on that, I'm going to say no.
Oh, okay, well, athletes are kind of on TV, but not like, oh, this is a hard one. Is it a male?
Yes.
Is it an athlete?
Yes.
There we go. How many questions am I at?
You have used 8 questions.
Okay, I've got 7 to go. And I've got 1 minute and 30.
All right.
All right, is it a baseball player?
Yes.
Great. Did they play for a team in the National League?
I cannot.
Oh, yeah.
answer for
Yeah,
you.
you're not a...
Sorry.
Could be a Mark question.
I'm incapable.
Did they play for the Chicago Cubs?
No.
Oh, man. I bet you this one's from Mark if I had to guess. Did they play for the White Sox?
Could you say that again?
Did they play for the White Sox? Chicago White Sox?
Yes, they played for the White Sox.
Okay, yeah, because he's a Sox fan. I think this came from Mark. Okay, under a minute. How many left?
You have 4 questions left.
Wow. My White Sox knowledge isn't as good. I've got over 30 seconds. I'm good. Was this person a batter as opposed to a pitcher? You're probably not sure.
I think so. I don't know.
Is this guy bald? Oh, he could be wearing a hat.
Really hard to tell.
Is he African American?
Yes.
Is it Frank Thomas?
No.
Oh, man.
We've got 2 left.
Oh, and time has now run out.
Ah.
Oh! Man.
Sorry, I wasn't more helpful on that one.
Yeah, it's all right. Gosh. Okay, well, who was it?
The person behind you is Ken Griffey Jr.
Oh! Ken Griffey Jr. Did he play for the White Sox?
That's what it says. In 2008, he played for the White Sox.
For a single season.
That counts.
That does count. But usually you don't think Ken Griffey Jr. White Sox. You think
that is from Mark.
Either the Mariners or even the Reds. Yeah. Brutal. Well done, Mark. You tricked me on that one. Stumped me. Well, oh well. I look forward to next week when we play another round of What's Behind Kurt. Thank you. This has been a lot of fun. All right. Let's learn a little bit more about our guest. Peter Gurry teaches at Phoenix Seminary. He is a lover of all things fast food and kindred spirit there. Now, Peter, we do a segment on the show we call Rapid Questions, and I didn't tell you about this intentionally.
Okay.
Look at this. He's turning a little red in the face now.
Oh, I'm having connection problems. Oh, no.
All right, it's just 60 seconds. They're fun, goofy questions. You will appreciate the first one, I can assure you. And so if you're ready, I'll start the game clock, and we'll get underway. So you ready?
Yep.
Okay. KFC or Taco Bell?
Ooh, Taco Bell.
What's your most hated sports franchise?
The Steelers.
Morning person or night owl?
More night owl.
Okay, what's your favorite board game?
Axis and Allies.
Favorite pizza topping?
Pepperoni.
Okay, favorite superhero?
Spider-Man.
What was the name of your first pet?
Oh, man. I had a lot of them. Pico.
Okay, who would you like to narrate your life?
Oh, man. What's his name? The guy who does Darth Vader, you know?
James Earl Jones.
James Earl Jones.
Okay, where would you rather go? Hogwarts, Narnia, or Middle Earth?
Oh, man. I'm going to say Narnia, I think.
Do you drink Dr. Pepper?
Yeah, occasionally.
Okay. Yes, occasionally. I'll take it. That's a winner.
I spent some time in Texas, so yeah.
Okay. Yes, that is Waco,
Texas. They drink
is the
Dr.
home.
Pepper like water down there.
Oh, yes, they do. Actually, more than water, it's like their blood. I mean, it's
like, yeah.
You know, no blood transfusions. They have Dr. Pepper transfusions down in Texas.
That's true. I mean, he is a doctor, so.
Yeah. Very nice. Thank you for playing that round of rapid questions. Let's jump back to our discussion. So in the first half, before we went to a break, you used some bigger terms here. The Byzantine and the Vaticanus.
Yes.
There you're referring to families of manuscripts. So
Vaticanus is an early manuscript from the 4th century, housed in the Vatican, so hence the name Vaticanus. And then the Byzantine text is a large group of manuscripts from the medieval period, from say the 9th century on, that tend to agree a lot with each other, or at least more than, say, earlier manuscripts tend to agree with each other.
So fewer variants within that group of texts.
Yeah.
Now, however, that's later. So, as you said, 9th century, that's not seeking to get to the earliest.
No. Now, to be fair, we do have one of the things with the Byzantine text is it's not uniform throughout the New Testament. So in the Gospels, you have it represented in Codex Alexandrinus in the 5th century already. Okay. And then there's just lots of discussion about whether you find it earlier in quotations of the church fathers. But even then, usually the earliest is Chrysostom. And there's debate about that as well, whether he's actually quoting the Byzantine or whether his sermons have been updated later to agree with the Byzantine text. So
interesting.
There's a lot.
And
there.
Is that just sort of theoretical, or is there evidence to suggest even from Chrysostom's manuscripts that there have been?
There is. So I've got a friend who's doing his doctoral dissertation right now on Chrysostom's sermons, and he's done just an initial kind of dip into Chrysostom. He's done a deep dive into one small part of Chrysostom, and he's found evidence for what he thinks is 2 recensions, that is, 2 versions of Chrysostom's sermons, one that follows the Byzantine text in his quotations and one that doesn't. So the potential there, a potential explanation there is if that holds true for the rest of Romans, which is what he's working on, it's very likely that scribes who are copying Chrysostom's sermons in the medieval period are changing his quotations to match the text of the Bible that they know, which would make sense. It's
because they think maybe he's making an error. Let's help him out.
Or it's maybe not even they think he's making an error. It's more just like it could be as simple as the way we do it with, like, if we're going to reprint a commentary of, say, Matthew Henry, we might reprint it, but then cite the ESV, let's say, which of course Matthew Henry didn't ever quote because it didn't exist, right? So something like that, just updating the biblical text. I was reading a book from German translated into English last night, and the translator at the beginning said he's used the NRSV throughout, right? Which obviously the German author didn't use in the German, in the German, right? So it's something like that. It's updating the biblical text for your audience to help them.
Right.
Could be as simple as that.
Right. So it's not nefarious.
Doesn't have to be. No.
Right.
It could be, but yeah.
And I know you mentioned your friend had done a deep dive into John Chrysostom. And many people maybe don't realize this. Chrysostom, in my assessment, is the East's version of Augustine in terms of his corpus and his influence.
It's hugely influential,
Hugely influential, and his corpus rivals Augustine when you compare it. When you're looking at other church fathers, he was an orator just like Augustine, and I kind of view them as the ancient N.T. Wrights of their day.
Yeah. I think Chrysostom is probably one of the most popular certainly the most popular Christian preacher. So, we just have tons of copies of Chrysostom's sermons in the medieval period. People loved him.
Yep.
And for a good reason.
Okay. You and I are sympathetic to the camp which strives to find the oldest manuscripts possible so we can get closest to the text. However, isn't it the case that sometimes oldest is not to be preferred on the variant issues? But explain why that is. Yeah.
So the basic principle is the assumption behind the preference for the earliest manuscripts is that they're closer to the authors, and so there's been less chance between the author and the copy for mistakes to enter in. Okay, so you have fewer opportunities for mistakes in between, fewer steps in between. And so the later you go, the presumption is the more mistakes creep in over time. Okay, now that can be true, but it doesn't have to be true, and it only takes one good early manuscript to be copied in the medieval period for all of a sudden there to be a medieval manuscript that has a good early text. Does that make sense? In other words, if you're a scribe and you're copying in the 12th century and you just happen to have a 4th century manuscript in your monastery, and it's a good 4th century manuscript, and you copy it really well, you've just created a 12th century manuscript with a 4th century text. Does that make sense? So the basic principle here is the date of the parchment and ink is not the same thing as the date of the text that's copied on it, right? Okay. The text itself may date much earlier than the parchment itself. So there's a principle that we have to be careful of in text criticism, to not assume that a later manuscript is necessarily a worse text. We actually have to just study the text and use our own text critical reasoning to try to adjudicate and say, well, based on what we know of the mistakes that scribes make, this 12th century manuscript has more of them, or it has less of them. Does that make sense?
So on the one hand, you've got a later scribe copying from an early manuscript, and so while maybe we don't have that anymore, but we've got the later manuscript, but because it was based on that earlier manuscript, we're good to go. Now on the other side too, maybe you have a situation where you have a 4th century manuscript, but which has been corrupted already.
Right.
And then if you have copies of that, even though it's early, it's no longer as good for any given passage, whereas you might have some other family of manuscripts where it's actually more faithful, even if those manuscripts are later, like the 9th century.
That's right.
So you sort of have two sides of the same coin.
That's right. So we know of a few medieval manuscripts that we know because the scribe tells us in the manuscript that he's copied from an early manuscript. So, it's a medieval manuscript, but we know based on texts we have there earlier and the agreement between them that it's earlier. Okay, the text is earlier, and then also because the scribe tells us, he says, I copied from an early and good manuscript. Okay, now generally speaking, scribes aren't going to tell you that they copy from a late, crappy manuscript.
Yeah, right. Who's going to?
They tend to not say that. Okay, but still, we have good reason to believe that scribe, right? On the other hand, we know of early manuscripts that at times preserve a good early text, but at times preserve a bad early text. Right? So something like Codex Beza, in my opinion, is a very funky manuscript from the 5th century and has a lot of readings in it that I think are not original, and yet it's still in the 5th century, right? Another example would be a manuscript like P72, which has 2 Peter, and it's not, in my opinion, a great manuscript overall, right? So I always tell people, if I had to choose one manuscript to take to a deserted island with me, I'd probably take Codex Vaticanus. I probably would not take Codex Bezae. Okay, but if you had to send me to a deserted island with a Byzantine manuscript, I'd be pretty happy still, right? Yeah. So people shouldn't assume that because I'm not a Byzantine guy that I think the Byzantine text is bad. I just think it's overall not as good as what's often found in the early manuscripts.
And when we're talking about the differences between the manuscripts as a percentage of the text as it is, what percentage are we talking about? 5% differences, 2% differences? Yeah.
So I would say, if I had my computer accessible, if I was on Skype right now, I'd pull it up, but probably in something like Codex Vaticanus and Minuscule 35, which is a good representative of the Byzantine text, you're looking at maybe 8 to 10% difference.
That's higher than I would think.
Well, now keep in mind, this is 8 to 10% difference in places where there is some difference among manuscripts. In other words, it's not 8% of the text as a whole, it's 8% of places where there's some variation. So it's actually a little bit smaller,
right?
If that makes sense. Okay?
No, for sure. Yeah.
But you can get agreement. You can get agreement between some manuscripts as high as 99%. And I think Vaticanus and Sinaiticus are something like 94%, something like that. I'm thinking of the Catholic letters and Acts, by the way, because that's where we have good data for this. But overall, the Byzantine text is not that different from the early text. It's easy to exaggerate the difference. People tend to think of them as like polar opposites, and they're as different as they could be. Well, no, they're not.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the KJV onlyists. So this is a movement of people who believe that we should stick with the authorized version. What's the, not that we have to go into the nitty gritty of the history, but what's the rationale here? I mean, this is, rare is it to say, oh, you only have to use the NIV and no other translations? I mean, that strikes me as odd.
Right. So it depends on which King James onlyist you talk to. So there actually are some, in my opinion, some significant differences among them. Some will say, maybe the extreme form is those that would say the King James version actually is a re-inspired version. So that where the King James differs from anything else, the King James is always right. Okay. A more responsible version is one that says the King James as a translation is not re-inspired, but something like the Greek edition behind the King James is the edition that was used by the Reformers. And because that was such a significant period of church history, that edition of the Greek New Testament has God's stamp of approval on it, his providential stamp of approval. Okay. And usually this is accompanied with a real concern, a deep concern for uncertainty about the Bible. So when I just talked about Jesus' prayer from the cross, they would find that just completely unacceptable, that I could be uncertain about that. They would say, if you're uncertain about that, then the Word of God is uncertain, and they can't have that. So I think it often is behind the view is when you cut through the text critical arguments and all that, it's really a theological position that's very, very uncomfortable with uncertainty at the level of the text. Does that make sense? So I don't happen to share their concern about that uncertainty. I don't need that level of certainty for my faith. And I don't think they should either. But they think they do, and so they think the King James is this kind of the safest way to get there. Does that make sense? I'm trying to be very, very
charitable.
Charitable is the word. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. No, it does make sense. Yes. And they are seeking a unjustifiably high level of certainty, which we don't use or care for.
We don't use it. I don't think we need. And their response to that would be, "But we're dealing with the Word of God, so it should have a higher standard than anything else, right?" Then at one level, I want to agree with that. My problem is they don't usually extend that same level of need for certainty to something like interpretation. In other words, when I talk to them, normally they're at least willing to admit that there are difficult passages in the Bible to understand, right? And I want to say, well, if you can have uncertainty about the meaning of the text, which to me is, in some ways is as important, then why can't I have some uncertainty about what the text is in some places, right? I don't see why it's a
fully agree
deal
with you
breaker.
there. Let me conclude by sort of shifting, if we will, back to reliability. Not necessarily looking at the areas where there are difficulties, but in the reliability of the text as it's transmissed compared to other non-Christian manuscripts. So, but not just transmissed, but also dating. Dating of the texts.
Yeah.
Let's sort of maybe end, if we will, on a good note. We've maybe said, well, hey, we got to be cautious about these apologetic arguments here and there and make modest claims, but and yet it remains the case that the New Testament is some of the, from a textual critical standpoint, some of the best attested material as it's transmissed and with regard to the dating compared to other documents of ancient history. Is what I just said a fair assessment, or am I making a mistake, or do I believe in a myth?
I think it is fair to say the New Testament is the best attested document from the ancient world. Okay, I think that's fair to say. We have earlier copies of it, generally speaking, than we have of other ancient literature, and we have more copies of it, generally speaking, than other ancient literature. So yes, I think that's fair to say. It's a question of how we want to press that argument, and then clarifying some of the details of the comparison. So we want to make sure when we compare the New Testament documents to other ancient literature that we're fair in the comparison. And what tends to happen among popular apologists is they give the biggest number they can find for the number of manuscripts of the New Testament, let's say. But then when they get to Homer, they find some number that's from 1950. And so it ends up being, 613 or whatever Bruce Metzger said way back when. And they don't realize that since then, actually, we've cataloged and discovered a lot more copies of Homer, for example, than Bruce Metzger knew about. So we just want to try to be fair. And then the other question is, what can the comparison really prove? It doesn't prove the New Testament is reliable. It just proves that it's better attested. So, for example, what I mean by that is Homer doesn't have to be poorly attested for the New Testament to be well attested. They can actually both be well attested. Okay, so we want to be careful that we don't we don't unnecessarily trash classical literature. Okay, I mean, you know what I'm saying? I mean, like, we love the Bible. That's really good, and we should. But like, we don't have to trash classical literature in the process of defending the Bible all the time. We don't have to try to make, Homer look as bad as he can. Okay, textually speaking. So, again, there's more in the details. We still have a lot of work to do in text criticism in the New Testament, precisely because we have so many manuscripts. It's a lot of material to work with, right? So it gives somebody like me, who's a professional text critic, a lot to do. But yes, I do think it's fair to say, in simple terms, the New Testament is better attested than classical literature.
And yeah, like you say again, and you make, sort of a qualified explanation there. When we take the same ruler and we're measuring these manuscripts and documents by that same standard, then here's what we get. So if someone's going to complain about X, Y, and Z about the New Testament, then that's going to lead, if they're going to be consistent with that ruler, for those issues, they're going to come to that conclusion, and that's a problem. That's a big problem.
And what tends to happen is, it is interesting to me that what tends to happen is people who have been trained in classics, okay, and then come to the New Testament tend to be very, very impressed with the textual evidence for the New Testament as compared to classical literature, okay? People that are New Testament trained tend to be the opposite. In other words, I don't know of many classicists who think the New Testament, they should be skeptical about the textual evidence for the New Testament, okay? So somebody like F.F. Bruce is a classic example, trained as a classicist, right? Then does New Testament, and he's really impressed with the evidence for the New Testament. Bart Ehrman has never been trained as a classicist, right? Okay. I could go through classical authors or classical scholars on my shelf who say things explicitly like the New Testament is the best attested document from the ancient world. Nothing compares to it. Okay. So I don't think they sometimes share the bias that some New Testament scholars have against the New Testament. There's actually some irony there. There's something else I was going to add to that, though. That's probably good enough. I can probably leave it there.
Yeah. And and the point is, when some New Testament scholars who aren't Christian are analyzing the text, they come in with their own presuppositions or worldview, and then they've got to stay consistent now because they've critiqued the Gospels on a certain standard, and this is going to put them in a tough spot, in a tight corner, which Christians don't have to go into. But maybe they think we're in different corners because, we think miracles are possible or something like that.
Right.
So,
and sometimes it's a question of, as an evangelical who believes in inerrancy, that is a different standard, right? Inerrant is a different standard than just historically reliable. Okay. Somebody like Herodotus may be historically reliable, but I don't think he's inerrant, right? So at some point there is something fair, like, F.F. Bruce kind of does this in his classic book, The New Testament Documents, Are They Reliable? He says, look, if somebody wants to ask for more evidence or better evidence for the New Testament than classical works, that's fair because of what we say the Bible is, what we say the New Testament is. But then he says, but the New Testament can match it. It can rise to the level. So there is always this question, though, of what's your standard? How much do you need? And I think somebody like Bart Ehrman probably comes to the New Testament with an unnecessarily high standard, at least in terms of text criticism. That's, in my opinion, is not quite fair to it.
Yes, and I would agree. Peter, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much for joining us on the program today. Again, co-editor of Myths and Mistakes in New Testament Textual Criticism, with a foreword by the Dan Wallace. We had Dan on when all that Mark fragment drama came out. Finally came out. After years. So it was a pleasure to have him on the show, and I enjoy meeting with him at ETS every year. So
it's great.
Peter, thank you so much. God bless you and your work, and your God's blessings to you over your continued scholarship. So this field is very important for Christians to be a part of and to dive into the history, the meat, the data, the facts, because it's so important for how we interpret the Scripture, what it was and what we should believe about it, for how we preach, as you said. Even pastors are preaching out of this text on a weekly basis. So,
Yep.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Kurt. I appreciate it.
Yep. God bless you. Well, that does it for the show today. I'm looking forward to the next couple weeks. We've got some great topics and some great guests lined up. We have yet to announce our episode 200 guest. It's going to be a lot of fun. Let's put it that way. Very excited for that interview. I'm grateful for the continued support that we have had throughout the years and for the future from our patrons. Those are folks that just chip in a few bucks each month, $5, $10, or $20. We'd love to get your support. I'm also grateful for the partnerships that we have with our sponsors. They are Defenders Media, Consult Kevin, The Sky Floor, Rethinking Hell, the Illinois Family Institute, and Fox Restoration. I want to thank our technical producer, Chris, for all the fine work that he does, and for Mark, our communications associate, who helps us with our scheduling and our announcements. And I want to thank our guest today, Peter Gurry, for the fine work that he's been doing in textual criticism. And last, but certainly not least, I want to thank you for listening in and for striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
You've been listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. This is a listener-supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.